Okay, so the question on everyone's mind right now is, are we in a recession or are we headed towards a recession? And whether we are or not, it is beginning to feel like we're in a recession. Prices are skyrocketing, people are losing their jobs. And so in this episode, I'm going to explore the question of whether we're in a recession or headed towards one. And actually, I'm going to give you a better question to ask. And finally, we're going to explore how this could impact you and your family. But before I dive into that, my name's Kevin Lum. I'm a certified financial planner, and I help people acquire the knowledge they need to retire without worry. And if you like this content, if you would do me a favor, click the like button, subscribe, ding that bell, leave a comment. All those help other people find our channel. And as a reminder, you're going to hear this a lot if you follow our channel, but I am a financial advisor, but I'm not your financial advisor. So nothing I should say should be taken as financial advice. I actually had a podcast once where I told people they shouldn't take my advice on anything in life except maybe do the opposite. But as a general rule, just don't take this as financial advice. Before you make any changes to your portfolio or anything else, be sure to talk to a financial professional. So here's the big question on a lot of people's minds. Are we in a recession or are we going to head into a recession or go into a recession? Before I answer that question, let me just give you some background. A common definition of a recession is 2 quarters of consecutive declining GDP or gross domestic product. Another way people judge recessions is simply significant economic decline that lasts more than a few months. The problem is, back to the question, are we in a recession? Are we headed towards a recession? It's an incredibly difficult question to answer because it's backwards looking. So it's almost impossible to know if you're in a recession until you're already deep inside of a recession and potentially coming out of it. But what we do know is that the Fed is trying to combat inflation. And to combat inflation, they're raising interest rates. And as interest rates rise, economic growth is going to slow considerably. So whether or not we are in a recession or not is really less important than whether we're going to see slowing economic growth. A lot of experts disagree about whether or not we're in a recession or going to be in a recession. In fact, just Google it right now. Are we in a recession or are we going into a recession? Or even try Googling, how bad will the recession be if we go into one? And you're going to find a million different viewpoints from a million different really smart people and experts. Now, JP Morgan said recently they did not believe that the US economy was in a recession, and they're still leaning towards the idea that we won't enter a recession. But honestly, the experts can't decide. And ultimately, it all comes down to the labor market. Initial jobless claims have begun to tick up higher, but they're still at some of the lowest levels in 30 years. But the Fed is trying to slow down the pace of economic growth so that they can get inflation under control. And so even in the best case scenario, the labor market is going to cool. People are going to lose their jobs. Business profits are going to shrink. The difference between a recession and a slowdown is simply the magnitude and the duration of the economic slowdown. So referring back to the study by JP Morgan, even at the best case scenario, like if the Fed gets the soft landing that they've been talking about, we could still see unemployment rates at around 4.1%, which means 1 million people could lose their jobs. And so the better question to ask is not, are we in a recession or are we headed towards a recession? But a better question to ask is there an economic slowdown on the horizon? And the answer to that question is most certainly yes. And so if an economic slowdown is almost a certainty, then how can that impact your family? Here's the thing. If there's an economic slowdown, people are going to lose their jobs and business profits are going to contract. So if you're a small business owner, maybe your job isn't at risk, but you could see your profits shrink. So if you feel there is a risk, so here's the thing I've been telling my clients, look, if you feel there's a risk to your income, you should cut your expenses and increase your cash on hand. In fact, I create a whole video where I go into detail of exactly how you can do that. You can click here and watch that video in detail. The biggest impact for most people is going to be on their business or on their job. But also, a lot of people have questions about the stock market because it seems that if there's going to be a recession, then the stock market could be impacted. But here's the thing, unlike the GDP, gross domestic product, the stock market is a forward-looking measure. So we've already experienced a drop in prices as investors have incorporated information about inflation, the Fed, Ukraine, and a million other different issues going on right now. Buyers and sellers are reflecting their expectations about future cash flows, including the impact of an economic downturn into their trade. This is one of the reasons I tell people that it's really hard to time the market, because by the time we know we're in a recession or there's going to be a market slowdown, the market is already looking around the corner to see what's next. And so while a recession is no walk in the park, it doesn't necessarily mean your portfolio is going to be doomed. And during that time, in 11 of the 15 instances of entering a recession, returns on stocks were positive 2 years after the recession began. And on average, the return was slightly under 8%. Now, it's not an amazing return, but it's also not destructive to your portfolio if you just stay the course. But part of the unease about the recession is also because we're in a bear market right now. And so, it's a double whammy because asset prices are falling, including home prices, at the exact moment you need more cash. Now, I made a whole video diving deeper into bear markets, and you can watch it here. But let me just quickly give you a recap of bear markets. While a recession usually refers to the economy, bear markets describe a particular market drawdown of 20% or more. Again, I went into this data in more detail, but from 1926 to 1921, the S&P index experienced the S&P 500 rather, experienced 17 different bear markets, which is kind of crazy. It's just every few years you get a bear market, which is, like I said, a fall of 20% from the most recent high. And the average length of a bear market was around 10 months. While many bear markets may sound daunting, the S&P index over the past 100 years, or since 1926, has actually had an annualized return of almost 10.5% in that same period. Had you had some factor tilts, it could have been even higher. Put another way, $1 invested in the S&P 500 in 1926 would have grown to $14,000. So $1 would have become $14,000 by the end of 2021, in spite of there being 15 recessions during that same time period, in spite of there being 17 different bear markets. Look, the most important thing you need to know is that it's human nature to try to identify patterns, but stock returns are ridiculously volatile and unpredictable, and we just can't predict the future. But we can gain insights from the past, and nearly a half century of market data has shown us that the good times in the market way outshine the bad times. And it can also be human nature to want to take action. When things are kind of falling apart, you want to do something. But emotional reactions around your investments will end up costing you a fortune over the long run. Selling after prices have already dropped can lead up to missing out on potential gains, and then trying to time when to get back in can also cost you money. You can't control what the Fed does or what happens to corporate profits, but you can control how you react. And so while the future is really uncertain, lessons from the past should bring you comfort that if you just stick with your plan, things are going to be okay. And here's some good news. Here's a chart I want to show you of how the market has behaved after massive drawdowns historically. The data on this chart is from 1926 through December of 2021. And on average, after a 22% drawdown, which is basically where we're at now, the market is up by 20% a year later on average, and 71% 5 years later on average. The trick is staying steady during these incredibly scary moments. And one other final piece of good news. JP Morgan said that for those building long-term multi-asset portfolios, and that could, even if you're in retirement, you can still have a long-term time horizon if you strategize properly. And for those building a long-term multi-asset portfolio, both stocks and bonds are providing the most attractive entry point in years. So just to recap, it's important to remember that while a recession may mean difficult times ahead for the economy as a whole, it doesn't necessarily mean that your portfolio is doomed. And if you are worried about your job or your business, this would be a good time to make sure you have larger cash reserves, which will allow you to not have to make any rash decisions during the middle of a prolonged, if that happens, a prolonged downturn. So if you're feeling uneasy about the market or hear talk about a coming recession, don't freak out. Just make sure you have cash reserves. don't be over leveraged and don't make any rash emotional decisions, and you're going to be just fine. Thanks for watching. If this content was helpful, please click the like button, subscribe, hit the bell, leave a comment, share it with your friends and your family. And also, we've set up a private Facebook group for people who are nearing retirement or who are already retired, or maybe just like the idea of being retired. You can ask questions about planning for retirement, trade tips and tricks, and ask about taxes and all kinds of different things. I'll be in there answering questions. And so you can find the link in the show notes below.